Arctic Point, Amasia. Hook. The blizzard hit Iron Creek like the end of the world. Inside Arctic Point Military Medical Center, the lights were still on, the monitors still beeping, the overnight staff still moving between beds. Right up until the emergency entrance exploded inward, and 4 men in tactical gear flooded the corridor with automatic weapons raised. Staff screamed. A corpsman dove behind a supply cart. Someone hit the floor pulling a patient's IV pole down with them. Every person in that hallway was shouting at the same person to run, to hide, to get down. Nurse Emily Carter, 29 years old, 5'6", stood perfectly still in the middle of the corridor and looked directly at the lead gunman. "You picked the wrong hospital," she said. 3 seconds later, the first attacker dropped, and nobody in that hallway had seen her move. If this story already has you hooked, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because this one goes places you won't see coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it started, Emily Carter had been on hour 9 of a 12-hour shift and was running on bad coffee and a granola bar she'd eaten standing over a medication cart at 2 a.m. Iron Creek, Alaska was not a glamorous posting. The town itself had maybe 6,000 permanent residents, a cannery that had seen better decades, 2 bars, and a road that became genuinely impassable for about 11 weeks out of every year. Arctic Point Military Medical Center served the remote marine installation 12 miles outside of town, and by extension, the civilian population that had no other hospital within 140 miles in any direction. Emily had been assigned there 8 months ago, transferred from a larger facility downstate after a scheduling conflict that her supervisor at the time had described, without much diplomacy, as a personality issue. What that meant, in practice, was that Emily had documented a medication error made by a senior physician, pushed the incident up the chain when her direct supervisor told her to let it go, and then found herself quietly reassigned to the edge of the continent before the ink was dry on the formal complaint. She hadn't fought it. That was the thing people didn't understand about her. She almost never fought the things that happened to her. She just kept moving. Iron Creek suited her in ways she didn't examine too carefully. The cold didn't bother her. The isolation didn't bother her. The Marines who cycled through the medical center were occasionally difficult patients, stubborn about pain, bad at following discharge instructions, prone to deciding they were fine before they were remotely fine. But she understood that particular brand of stubbornness better than she'd ever let on. Her shift partner that night was a traveling nurse named Dara Osei, 26, who had arrived from Atlanta 4 months ago and spent approximately 60% of her working hours talking about how she was not going to renew her contract, and the other 40% being very good at her job. They had reached the comfortable stage of co-workership where they could go 40 minutes without speaking, and neither of them took it personally. "Weather's getting ugly," Dara said, not looking up from the chart she was updating. The wind had been building for 2 hours, and the windows on the north side of the building had started making a low, continuous moan that the older staff called the usual, and the newer staff found deeply unsettling. "Storm's supposed to peak around 4, Emily said. She was rechecking the medication dosages for a Marine in bed 6. Staff Sergeant Rourke, 31, post-surgical, recovering from a shrapnel wound to the left thigh that had gone septic before he'd admitted it was serious. He was asleep now, which was the best thing for him. "Road'll be closed by morning," Dara said. "Road's already closed." Dara looked up. "For real?" "Checked 20 minutes ago. Nothing in or out until they plow." Emily marked the chart and moved to the next bed. "We're at until at least 0700. Dara absorbed this and went back to her charting. "Great. Love being stranded in a hospital during a blizzard. Very calming environment." Emily almost smiled. Almost. The first explosion, and she recognized it as an explosion immediately, not a door slamming, not a generator fault, came from the level below them at 2:41 a.m. She was already moving before the sound finished echoing. The stairwell door hit the wall when she pushed through it. Below her, in the ground floor corridor, she could hear shouts. The specific kind that weren't panic, that had direction and command built into them. And underneath those, the sounds of people scrambling that were panic. A crash. Something heavy falling, And then, unmistakably, the distinct mechanical sound of a weapon being racked. Emily stopped on the landing between floors. She did not keep going down. She did not retreat back up. She stood completely still for approximately 4 seconds and listened. 4 entry points to the ground floor. Emergency entrance, main entrance, loading dock at the east end, service corridor from the parking structure. The sounds were coming from the emergency entrance and spreading east, which meant they'd come through the main breach and were moving toward the interior rather than securing the perimeter first. That was either arrogance or urgency, possibly both. She counted voices. 4 distinct command voices in the corridor below, which meant a team of at least that size, probably more stationed outside. Automatic weapons, no communication with any hospital security, which meant security was already down or had fled. She went back through the stairwell door. Dara was in the hallway, phone in hand, looking at Emily with an expression that was trying very hard to be calm and not quite getting there. I heard. I know. Emily moved past her toward the nursing station. Get every patient on this floor, mobile or movable, back corridor, the storage wing, away from the stairwells. What is happening? Armed entry, ground floor, moving inward. How many patients can walk? Dara's training kicked over whatever else she'd been about to say. 3. Rourke can't, and neither can Vasquez. She's still post-anesthesia. Wheelchairs for Rourke and Vasquez. The 3 who can walk, you move them now. Back corridor. Lock the connecting door and do not open it for anyone until you hear my voice. Emily. Dara. She looked at her directly. Move fast and stay quiet. I'll be right behind you. It was a partial truth. She wasn't going to be right behind her. She waited until Dara turned and started moving, and then she went to the medication storage room, which was the one room on the ward with an internal lock and no external windows, and which happened to share a wall with the maintenance access corridor that ran the length of the building below floor level. There was a panel in the back of the medication storage room that was labeled HVAC Access. Do not block. Emily had noticed it her second week on the posting, in the way she noticed most things, cataloging it, filing it, not thinking about it consciously again until she needed it. She needed it now. The access corridor was not designed for human navigation. It was designed for ductwork and pipes. Emily moved through it on her hands and knees in near total darkness, one hand on the pipe to her left as a guide, tracking sound through the building the way the building's own air moved, downward and east toward the emergency entrance. She came up through a floor access panel in a utility closet off the main ground floor corridor, behind the position the attackers had already passed. There were 6 of them on the ground floor. She confirmed this in the first 30 seconds of observation through a 2-inch gap in the closet door. 6, not 4. 4 had moved toward the interior, and 2 were stationed at the emergency entrance, which they'd secured behind them. They were dressed in cold-weather tactical gear with no identifying markings, carrying weapons that were not standard civilian issue. These weren't panicked criminals. They were organized. The ground floor nursing station had been cleared. The 2 staff members who'd been on duty were zip-tied to the waiting area chairs, scared but visibly unharmed. The attackers were moving with purpose towards something, not just creating chaos. Emily watched the 2 at the entrance, watched their pattern, watched where they looked and how often and for how long. She had not done this in 3 years. Her hands were steady. One of the men at the entrance moved to check his radio and turned 45 degrees away from his partner. The partner was watching the interior corridor and not the utility closet. Emily was out of the closet in 2 seconds. The first man didn't finish turning back around. The second man got a syllable out before he didn't either. She zip-tied both of them with the restraints from the emergency station supply cabinet, the same ones they'd used on the nursing staff, and moved to the 2 zip-tied nurses, cutting them loose with a pair of bandage scissors. Back stairwell, she said quietly. Second floor, back corridor, knock twice slowly. Don't run. Walk fast. Keep low. Don't look back. The older nurse, a woman named Pilar, who'd been at Arctic Point for 11 years, grabbed Emily's arm. They took Dr. Marchand. They took him toward radiology. Emily filed that. How many staff unaccounted for? I don't know, maybe. There were 4 of us down here when they came in. Go, now. Both of you." They went. The next thing Emily needed was information and a position in that order. She moved through the ground floor using service corridors she'd memorized during the building's mandatory fire safety orientation, the one that most of the rotating staff sat through on their phones, and that Emily had spent actually looking at the floor plans. She found the first of the 4 interior attackers near radiology, which confirmed what Pilar had told her. They had Marchand, the hospital's senior physician on overnight duty, a 53-year-old former Army surgeon named Warren Marchand, who ran the night shift with a specific brand of exhausted competence that Emily had developed a cautious respect for. They were using him as a key, moving through the secure sections of the building. The second man she took down in the radiology corridor. The third, near the pharmaceutical storage. By the time the fourth realized something was wrong, he'd lost communication with 3 of his teammates, and the 2 at the entrance weren't answering. He made a mistake then. He spoke out loud. Not quietly, not over his radio. He actually spoke out loud to the corridor around him, the way people do when they're trying to project calm they don't feel. "Whoever's doing this, you don't know what you walked into." Emily was behind the supply cart 12 feet to his left. "I was thinking the same thing about you," she said. He spun. She was already gone, dropped below the cart line, moving lateral, and when he tracked right, she came from the left, and that was the end of that conversation. Dr. Marchand was in the radiology prep room, hands zip-tied to a chair, a cut above his eyebrow that had bled significantly down his face, but wasn't deep. He stared at Emily when she came through the door. "Carter?" His voice was genuinely baffled. "What? How did you—" "I need you to stay here," she said, cutting his restraints. "Don't turn the lights on. There are 2 more of them, and I haven't found them yet." 2 more. "Emily, there are armed men in the hospital." "I know. I've handled 4 of them." She checked the corridor through the door gap. "Clear." "You're going to lock this door and stay down. The staff on the 2nd floor are in the back corridor. You'll be able to reach them in about 10 minutes when I tell you it's clear." Marchand looked at her face, looked at the way she was holding herself, looked at the absolute lack of panic in her expression. "Who are you?" he said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Your nurse," Emily said. "Lock the door." The 2 remaining men were the problem. They were together, which meant they'd noticed the silence and consolidated, smart enough to recognize the pattern of what had happened to their team, and smart enough not to split up further. They'd moved to the generator room, which was the building's most defensible interior position. Single entry point, concrete walls, direct access to the power systems. They were going to use the hospital's infrastructure as leverage. Emily stood outside the generator room door and thought about this for a moment. The door was solid steel. She wasn't going through it directly. The ceiling above the generator room was a false ceiling, acoustic tile over a mechanical access space that served the entire east wing. She'd noted the ceiling access point in the east corridor during that same fire safety orientation. She went up. Moving across ceiling tiles in the dark above the generator room required approximately 3 minutes of extremely careful weight distribution and 0 sound. She found the tile directly above the room's interior, confirmed the position of both men below through the gap at the tile's edge, both looking at the door, not the ceiling. And then she did something she'd learned a long time ago, in a different life, in a different kind of building. She made a noise, not at the ceiling tile, at the air duct 15 feet to the east. Both men turned toward it. She came down through the tile on the west end. It wasn't clean. The second man was faster than she'd accounted for and got a hand on her before she'd fully closed the distance, and they went into the generator housing hard enough that she felt it in her shoulder for a week afterward. But the room had a lot of hard surfaces, and she used 3 of them before it was over. She sat on the floor of the generator room for exactly 60 seconds afterward, breathing. Her hands were still steady. She found that mildly surprising, if she was honest. The facility had a backup radio in the security station, which she reached 2 minutes later. She raised the marine installation on the emergency frequency. The storm had chewed through the cellular repeaters, but the hardline radio was still working, and got a corporal on the other end who sounded like he'd been asleep. "This is Nurse Carter at Arctic Point Medical," she said. "I need you to wake up your duty officer right now and tell them we had an armed incursion. 6 attackers, all incapacitated. No fatalities on staff, 2 staff members sustained minor injuries. I need a team here. I need medical backup for the team currently on the installation, and I need someone to tell me who these people are, because their gear is not civilian issue, and neither are their weapons. A very long pause on the other end. Ma'am, the corporal said slowly. Did you just say 6 attackers? All incapacitated, Emily said. Send a team. She set down the radio and started the walk back toward the second floor to let her patients know it was over. She was halfway up the stairwell when the south entrance, the one she hadn't covered because she'd been operating on the assumption that the storm had sealed it, came open. 3 more men came through it. She stopped on the landing. 9 then, not 6. 9, and the last 3 had waited out her clearance of the first group before making entry. One of them looked up the stairwell and saw her. That's her, he said. And the way he said it, the specific weight on those 2 words, the way it landed like a confirmation rather than a discovery, told Emily something she hadn't known 30 seconds ago. They hadn't come for the hospital. They'd come for her. The landing door to the second floor was 20 feet above her. The ground floor was blocked below. The stairwell was a kill box. 4 concrete walls, 1 exit up, 1 exit down, and 3 armed men starting up the stairs. Emily looked at the fire suppression pipe that ran along the stairwell's east wall, looked at the junction box 6 feet up the wall to her left, looked at the door to the second floor mechanical space that the hospital's maintenance chief had propped open 3 weeks ago because the latch was broken and hadn't been fixed yet. She looked at all of this in about 2 seconds. Then she moved. The fire suppression pipe took her weight, barely, and only for the 3 seconds she needed to reach the junction box, which she used as a step to the broken mechanical space door, which swung open inward, and she was through it before the first of the 3 men reached the landing below. The mechanical space for the second floor ran above the patient rooms. Emily moved through it at a crouch, fast, tracking the sound of the men below her through the floor structure. They were coordinating. She could hear the cadence of it, the call and response of a search pattern. They knew how to clear a building. That was a problem. They also knew, or thought they knew, who they were looking for. That was a different kind of problem, and a larger one, and it sat in Emily's chest with a specific weight that she recognized from a long time ago, the weight of something you've been waiting for, that you hoped wouldn't come, that has come anyway. She reached the second floor access panel above the back corridor, directly above the door, behind which Dara and the patients and the 2 ground floor nurses were waiting. She couldn't open that panel, not with the search team below her, not without giving away the position. She needed to redirect them, draw them away from the corridor, back toward the ground floor, buy enough time for the Marine team to reach them. She was still working out exactly how to do this when, from somewhere below in the ground floor corridor, she heard a sound she hadn't expected. A radio transmission. Clear, unencrypted, coming through one of the attacker's own communication systems. A voice she didn't recognize. Calm, clipped, authoritative. Change of plan. Don't engage. Confirm her location and hold position. And then, after a pause, command needs her alive. Emily went very still in the dark above the patient corridor. Below her, the search team went still too. She heard one of them say quietly to the others, "Alive. You heard it." "Yeah," said another, sigh. "Somebody upstairs just made her a lot more valuable than a body." "Means they're scared of what she knows," said the third. A long silence in the mechanical space above the second floor of Arctic Point Military Medical Center, while the storm screamed against the building's outer walls and the lights flickered twice and the temperature in the unheated crawlspace dropped another 2 degrees. Emily thought about what she knew. She thought about the past 3 years, the transfer to Iron Creek, the quiet posting, the careful distance she'd kept from everything she'd walked away from. She thought about a weapons cache in a forward operating base that shouldn't have existed. She thought about a report she'd filed that had disappeared into an administrative review that had never produced results. She thought about the fact that she'd told herself for 3 years that the disappearance of that report was probably just bureaucratic failure. She was no longer telling herself that. Below her in the corridor, one of the men's radios clicked again. "Extraction team is 12 minutes out," the voice said. "Hold her. We cannot let her reach the Marines." Emily Carter lay flat in the crawl space above the second floor of her hospital, listening to the storm and the men below. and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not fear, exactly. Something colder than fear and more useful. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and found, by touch, the broken tile bolt she'd pocketed when she came down from the generator room ceiling. She turned it over in her fingers. 12 minutes. She had 12 minutes before an extraction team arrived. 3 armed men between her and her patients. A Marine response team that might or might not reach them in time. And evidence somewhere in this building. On the gear of the men she'd taken down. In their communications equipment. In the weapons they were carrying. That connected to something much larger than an attack on a remote Alaskan hospital. She was not going to spend those 12 minutes hiding in a ceiling. She started moving. The crawl space above the second floor was exactly 31 inches of clearance between the ceiling joists and the subfloor above. Emily had measured it by feel during the first pass-through, cataloging without thinking about it, the way she always did. 31 inches was enough to move flat on her stomach without the structure creaking, if she distributed her weight across 3 points and kept her pace below a certain speed. She knew this because she'd spent 12 minutes in it already, and the men below hadn't heard her once. She also knew she couldn't maintain that pace for the next 12 minutes and accomplish anything useful. The extraction team was the problem she kept returning to. The 6 men she'd handled were not extraction. They'd been the breach team, the ones meant to cause enough chaos that whatever came next had clear space to operate. 3 of them had been held back specifically for her, which meant whoever was running this operation had anticipated that the first 6 might not be enough. That level of planning didn't happen overnight. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had resources. The radio she'd heard through the floor below her was still transmitting intermittently. She could track the voices even through the insulation and the structural noise of the storm. The 3 men were moving, slowly, doing a systematic sweep of the ground floor's secondary rooms while keeping a loose perimeter on the stairwell. They weren't rushing. They were waiting for the extraction team and keeping the exits covered. Emily moved toward the east end of the crawl space. The east end terminated above the hospital's trauma bay, which was sealed and unused during the overnight shift except for the supply staging area along its south wall. More importantly, the trauma bay had a direct external access point, the ambulance bay, which connected to the parking structure, which was how the final 3 had come in through the south entrance. She found the access panel above the trauma bay and tested its edge with 2 fingers. It gave slightly. No latch on this one, just resting weight. She eased it up half an inch and looked through. The trauma bay was dark and empty. No one had thought to post someone here because no one had thought this position mattered. She dropped down, caught herself on the gurney rail below, came down the rest of the way without sound. Straightened up. On the wall beside the trauma bay entrance there was an emergency equipment cabinet, the kind that every room of this type was required to have, stocked quarterly, and that most people walked past without ever really looking at. Emily opened it and took stock of what was there in about 4 seconds. Defibrillator, O2 unit, trauma bandages, an emergency airway kit, and, because this particular cabinet had been stocked for a facility serving an active military installation, a tourniquet and 2 chest seals still in packaging. She was not here for the medical supplies. Behind the defibrillator, pushed to the back of the lower shelf, was the cabinet's secondary contents, a handheld radio, still in its charging cradle, that was part of the hospital's internal emergency communication system, the system that worked off the building's own hardwired network rather than the cell repeaters the storm had killed. She keyed the radio to the frequency she'd used from the security station and raised the same corporal she'd spoken to 20 minutes ago. "This is Carter again. Where's my team?" The corporal's voice was different now, not half asleep, sharply awake. "Ma'am, duty officer is Lieutenant Colonel Bryce. She's been briefed. We have a response team en route. ETA 14 minutes, storm slowing them. There's a secondary team inbound on the attacker's side," Emily said. "Extraction team. Their radio said 12 minutes. That was 6 minutes ago. Your team needs to move faster." "We're moving as fast as the road allows. Go around the road." A pause. "Ma'am, there's a blizzard." "I know there's a blizzard, Corporal. Go around the road. Over." She clipped the radio to her scrub pocket. It was small enough, and moved back toward the trauma bay door. She needed those communications devices. The ones on the men she'd already taken down. The first 4 she'd handled were still in the position she'd left them, zip-tied, conscious or approaching consciousness. none of them going anywhere. She'd left their gear on them because she hadn't had time for anything else. Now she had 6 minutes and a different priority. She moved through the ground floor carefully. The 3 active searchers were working the east corridor. She could track their sweep from the radio updates they were exchanging with each other, short and clipped. The language of people who'd done this kind of thing in buildings before. She went west, to the corridor near the pharmaceutical storage where the 3rd man she'd handled was secured to a pipe bracket. He was awake. He watched her come toward him with an expression that was trying to look like it wasn't afraid. "You're Carter," he said. She crouched beside him and started going through the outer pockets of his tactical vest. "You know my name. Everybody knows your name." That's an overstatement. She found his radio, pocketed it. Found a phone. Locked, biometric, useless to her. Found something more useful in the inner chest pocket. A folded document, printed, with a building schematic on one side and what looked like an itinerary on the other. She unfolded it under the beam of the small flashlight she'd taken from the emergency cabinet. The building schematic was Arctic Point Medical, her hospital. Room by room, labeled with staff names and shift assignments. Her name was on it. Nursing Station 2N, night shift, circled in red pen. She looked at the itinerary side. Times, locations, alphanumeric designations she didn't immediately recognize. The last line read, "Package secured, extraction 0320. It was currently 0314. She looked at the man zip-tied to the pipe bracket. "Who's running this?" "You're not going to get anything out of me." "I don't need anything from you," Emily said. "I've got your documentation." She stood, folded the paper, put it in her pocket. "The Marine team is 6 minutes out. You should probably think about what your cooperation is worth before they get here." She left him and moved back toward the stairwell. The plan, if she'd had time to call it a plan, was straightforward enough. The 3 active searchers needed to be redirected away from the stairwell and away from the 2nd floor before the extraction team arrived. If the extraction team came in through the south entrance and found their breach team neutralized, they'd regroup. If they came in and found the hospital still actively defended, they'd either press or pull back depending on what their orders actually were. The radio transmission had said, "Command needs her alive." That was a constraint on the extraction team, not just the breach team, which meant they weren't going to come in shooting. They were going to come in trying to take her out of this building in a state that allowed her to be interrogated. That was, from a tactical standpoint, both better and worse than the alternative. She was on the ground floor west corridor when the radio in her pocket, the one she'd taken from the pharmaceutical storage, lit up with an incoming transmission. A different voice this time, not the calm, clipped one from before. Older, and something in it that wasn't quite controlled. "Breach team, report status." Silence. "Breach team." A harder edge. "Report." More silence. Then, from somewhere in the east corridor, one of the 3 active searchers. "Extraction, be advised. Breach team is down. All 6. We have a situation." A very long pause. "All 6?" the older voice repeated. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of someone doing a rapid reassessment. "Affirmative. She's still in the building. We have eyes on the stairwell. She can't reach the 2nd floor." Emily, standing 20 feet from the stairwell she had no intention of using, felt a very small and deeply unpleasant sense of respect for whoever had designed this operation. They'd thought about the 2nd floor. They'd thought about the patients. They'd used that as a choke point. They hadn't thought about the crawl space. She went back to the stairwell door, not through it, to the supply alcove beside it, and waited. The east corridor sweep was going to bring the searchers back toward this position in the next 2 to 3 minutes. She needed one of them close enough to separate from the others. While she waited, she kept turning the schematic over in her head. The room labels, the staff assignments. This had been prepared recently. It had her current assignment on it, Night Shift 2N, which meant someone had accessed the hospital's scheduling system within the past week. You didn't get that from a general records search. You got that from someone with specific access to the facility's internal systems, or from someone embedded within the institution's administrative structure. That thought sat in her chest and did not improve with examination. The sound of boots on linoleum, east corridor approaching. She counted the footfall rhythm. One person, moving ahead of the others. She waited. The door to the supply alcove was partially open. She was behind it, which meant anyone coming from the east would see the alcove, might see the door, and might decide it was worth checking. That was what she was counting on. The footsteps slowed near the alcove. She heard breathing, someone standing, looking. He came through the door with his weapon up, which was the right move and the wrong outcome for him, because the weapon was the first thing she controlled and the rest followed from there. He went down without raising an alarm. She used his own zip ties. Two left in the east corridor. She heard one of them say, from further away, "Garrick! Garrick, you copy?" No answer, obviously. "Extraction, we may have another contact. Garrick's not responding." "Find her," the older voice said, and now the control was gone from it entirely. "She cannot leave that building with what she's carrying." Emily's hand went to her pocket. The folded schematic. She hadn't been thinking about it as something she was carrying in that sense. She'd been thinking about it as intelligence she'd found. But the extraction team's handler wasn't worried about her getting to the Marines. He was worried about what she would bring with her when she did, which meant the schematic wasn't just a schematic. She pulled it out again, moved to the emergency exit sign's red glow at the end of the supply alcove, and looked at the itinerary side again. The alphanumeric designations she hadn't recognized. She went through them differently now, not looking for obvious meaning, looking for structure. 3 columns. A date column, all within the past 6 months. A location column, the alphanumerics, which she now read as grid coordinates rather than arbitrary designations. And a third column that she'd read as reference numbers, but now looked at differently. They were weight designations, cargo weights. She put the schematic back in her pocket and pressed herself flat against the alcove wall because the second of the 2 remaining East Corridor searchers had just come around the corner and was 30 feet away and moving fast. She needed to think about this later. Right now, she needed to not be found. He was moving fast because Garrick hadn't responded, because his team was down to 2, because the extraction team was close, and he was trying to cover ground before they arrived, and he had to explain to someone with authority why 6 men had been neutralized by a hospital nurse in under 20 minutes. He was scared and covering it with speed, and he didn't clear the alcove before he passed it. She was behind him before he finished passing. That left one active searcher, in a building where all the exits were covered by incoming Marines and an extraction team that was now about 3 minutes out. One searcher who had a radio and was reporting back to a handler who was beginning to understand that the operational calculus had shifted in a way that was not recoverable. Emily stood in the supply alcove and listened to the building. The storm was still going. The wind had a different quality now. Less sustained, more gusting, which meant the worst of it had peaked, and the Marines on the road might have just gotten marginally better visibility. The lights on the ground floor had been steady for the past 10 minutes, which meant the generator was holding. The remaining searcher was somewhere in the east wing. She could hear him. Not footsteps now, but the occasional small creak of the building that happened when someone was trying not to make footsteps. He'd gone still. He was waiting too. Her radio crackled. "Carter," the older voice, directly on her frequency now. They'd scanned for active transmissions and found the one she'd taken from the pharmaceutical storage. Of course they had. "Carter, I know you're listening." She didn't answer. "You found the document," the voice said. "I know you did, because you went back for the gear, and Renfrew is the one you would have checked first. So you have it. And you're smart enough to understand what it means." She was starting to understand what it meant. She wanted him to keep talking. "We're not here to hurt anyone in that hospital. We never were. You were a retrieval target, not a... This wasn't supposed to go this way." A pause. Something in his voice that might have been genuine and might have been tactical. Come out, and we get on the transport, and I promise you, on my word, that everyone in that building walks away from tonight." Emily kept her breathing even. "Or," the voice said, and the something genuine evaporated, "my team comes in, and we find you the hard way, and the people in that hospital get to watch." She keyed the radio. "Your team's already had the hard way." A silence on the other end, then, "You've been out of the field for 3 years." "I know. You took down 6 trained operators in..." "But 7, she said. "Garrick was 8. Another silence, longer. "The document," he said finally. "Give it back and we stand down. You have my word." "Your word," Emily said. is attached to an operation that put my name on a target list and sent 9 men into a civilian medical facility during a blizzard. I'm going to need something more than your word." She turned the radio off. They knew her frequency now, which made it a liability rather than an asset. She'd gotten what she needed from the transmission. He was scared of the document, which confirmed what she'd started to piece together from the cargo weight column. And he was stalling, which meant the extraction team's actual arrival was further out than the 3 minutes he'd implied. She came out of the supply alcove and moved east. The remaining searcher heard her. He'd found a position behind the nurses' station at the far end of the east corridor, better cover than most of what the ground floor offered, and it put his back to the wall with sight lines on both approaches. He called out before she was in range.
"I can see you." "Then you know I'm alone," Emily said, stopping where she was in the middle of the corridor. "Your whole team is secured. The Marines are 3 minutes out, maybe less. Your extraction team is not as close as your handler told you." "You don't know. I know he's scared," she said. "And I know you're the last one, which means you're the one who gets to make a decision tonight that the other 8 didn't get to make." She kept her voice level. She wasn't trying to intimidate. There wasn't much point in that now. "When the Marines come through that door, what they find is going to determine what happens to you for the next 15 to 20 years. That's a fact, not a threat." A long pause from behind the nursing station. "They'll charge me regardless," he said. "Armed incursion, assault, federal—" "Yes," Emily said. "All of that. But what you know about the operation that sent you here, that's worth something. To the right people, that's worth a great deal." She paused. "Or you can wait for your handler to decide you're a liability and cut communication, which I give him about 90 seconds to do once he realizes the extraction isn't happening." The man behind the nursing station was quiet for a moment. Then, "The document you found. Do you know what it is?" "Cargo manifests," Emily said. 6 months of them. Grid coordinates that I'm going to need a military map to cross-reference, but I've got a reasonable guess." "They move it through the medical supply chain," he said, and his voice had gone flat. Not cooperative, exactly. More like someone who'd made a decision they'd been sitting on for a while. "Shipping containers, labeled as medical equipment, routed through legitimate hospital procurement channels. Nobody checks medical supply shipments the way they check other cargo. It's been running for almost 2 years." Emily was very still. Medical supply procurement, routed through hospitals. She thought about Arctic Point's supply chain, the regular shipments from the regional distribution hub, the containers she'd walked past on receiving dock days, labeled with the names of manufacturers she'd never had reason to doubt. "The installation," she said, "the military installation here, was a transit point. Has been for 14 months. He paused. "Why do you think they transferred you here?" She had thought, for 3 years, that the transfer to Iron Creek was punishment, bureaucratic exile, the consequence of filing a complaint that inconvenienced people with more authority than her. She stood in the east corridor of Arctic Point Military Medical Center at 03:18 in the morning, in the middle of a blizzard, and recalibrated the past 3 years of her life in about 15 seconds. "They put me here to watch," she said. "To watch and to contain," he said. "You saw something in the field, in the report you filed, the one that disappeared. Someone decided it was easier to have you in a remote posting where your access was limited and your credibility was manageable." He paused. "Tonight was about the manifest. They found out you'd searched the supply manifests. Someone in hospital administration flagged a records access. They thought you'd already found it." "I hadn't," Emily said. "I was checking a medication discrepancy in the quarterly order. I wasn't looking for anything." "They didn't know that." She heard it then. Through the building's walls, through the storm, the distant but unmistakable sound of vehicle engines. More than one. From the north, which was the main installation road. The Marines. The man behind the nursing station heard it too. She heard him exhale. A long, ragged breath that had a lot of different things in it. "I'm going to stand up," he said. "I'm going to keep my hands visible." "Okay," Emily said. He stood up from behind the nursing station with his hands at shoulder height, weapon left on the floor behind the counter. He was younger than she'd expected. Mid-20s, maybe, with the kind of face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like.
He was scared in a way that the others hadn't been or hadn't shown. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't know about the hospital. I thought it was a facility extraction. Get one person out. I didn't know there'd be patients." Emily looked at him. She didn't know whether she believed him, and she didn't have enough to go on to decide. "That's between you and whatever investigation follows this," she said. "Right now you're going to stay exactly where you are with your hands where I can see them until the Marines come through that door." He nodded. Stayed where he was. The engines outside grew louder. Headlights hit the north-facing windows and threw long shadows across the ground floor corridor. Emily pulled the schematic from her pocket one more time and looked at the final line of the itinerary. Package secured. Extraction. 0320. It was 0319. She thought about what package meant, in the context of someone who had filed a complaint that disappeared, who had been transferred to a remote posting, who had spent 3 years assuming it was bureaucratic consequence and not strategic placement. She thought about the cargo manifests and the grid coordinates and the military installation 12 miles from a hospital that received regular, unexamined supply shipments. She thought about the fact that she had, entirely by accident, just prevented an extraction that would have removed the one person in a position to connect the manifest to the installation to the wider operation that someone had spent 14 months building inside the legitimate infrastructure of the United States military. The emergency entrance opened. Marines came through in force. 6 of them, full gear, weapons up, sweeping the corridor in the precise and coordinated way that meant someone had briefed them on a real threat rather than sending them in unprepared. Behind them, a 7th figure in a cold-weather field jacket with the insignia of a lieutenant colonel, moving with the particular kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. The lieutenant colonel was a woman, maybe 45, with close-cropped gray at her temples and an expression that was taking in the corridor. The secured attackers, the last standing searcher with his hands raised, the complete and undisturbed quiet of a building that should have been in chaos, with something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. Her eyes found Emily. Emily was standing in the middle of the east corridor in her nursing scrubs, a folded schematic in her left hand and a zip-tie cutter in her right, and she was aware that she looked absolutely nothing like what the situation apparently required her to have been, and she was too tired to find that funny. The lieutenant colonel walked the length of the corridor and stopped 4 feet away. "You're Carter," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Lieutenant Colonel Daria Bryce." She looked Emily up and down once, not dismissively, more like she was doing an assessment, and the assessment was coming back with results she hadn't anticipated. "My corporal said you called in 6 attackers and then called back to add 2 more. 8, Emily said. "The 9th one is cooperating." Bryce glanced at the man standing behind the nursing station with his hands up, then back at Emily. "In what capacity were you? What's your background, Carter?" It was the question she'd spent 3 years not answering, not lying about exactly. She'd just never volunteered it, and no one at Arctic Point had asked. You didn't ask nurses about their backgrounds the same way you asked physicians, which was one of the reasons she'd chosen nursing after she'd left the other life behind. She held out the schematic. Bryce took it, unfolded it, looked at it. Her expression shifted in a way that was small but significant. "Where did you get this?" "Inner chest pocket, 3rd man I secured, pharmaceutical storage corridor." Emily paused. "The grid coordinates on the itinerary side are transit points. I haven't had access to a military map to confirm, but I believe at least 2 of them correspond to positions within 30 miles of this installation. The cargo weights suggest—" "Carter." Bryce's voice was quiet, not interrupting, stopping her. "How do you know how to read a document like this?" The corridor was quiet except for the storm and the distant sounds of the Marine team working through the building, confirming the secured positions. The young man behind the nursing station was watching. The motion sensor lights in the east corridor had come back on at full brightness. Emily was very tired. Her shoulder hurt where she'd gone into the generator housing. She had a split in the skin along her left knuckle that she hadn't noticed until it had gotten cold enough for the blood to dry against her skin, and she was going to need to clean that properly before it became her problem in a professional capacity. "I was a combat medic," she said. "Field operations, 2 tours. I filed a report on an anomalous supply cache 3 years ago, and then I got transferred here. Bryce held the schematic and looked at Emily for a long moment with an expression that was doing something complicated. Field operations, she said.
Yes, ma'am. With which unit? Emily told her. The lieutenant colonel went completely still for 2 full seconds. Then she looked down at the schematic again, and something clicked into place behind her eyes that had not been there before. A recognition, or a recalibration, or possibly both at once. The report you filed 3 years ago, Bryce said. The one that went into administrative review and didn't produce results. Yes. We've been looking for the origin of that report for 18 months. Bryce's voice was very careful now, in the way that someone's voice gets careful when they're trying not to say something at the wrong speed. We couldn't find the source. The intake records were altered. Emily said nothing. The operation connected to these manifests, we've had a partial picture for 8 months. We knew there was a transit infrastructure using medical supply chains. We could not identify the specific installation being used as the hub.
Bryce looked at the schematic, then at Emily. You have been 20 miles from the hub for 3 years. I know, Emily said. They sent 9 men to pull you out of this building before you could reach us. I know that too. Bryce folded the schematic carefully and held it. Around them, the building was coming back to life. She could hear Dara's voice from the 2nd floor, the sound of the back corridor door opening, staff beginning to move. Somewhere down the hall, Dr. Marchand was probably still in the radiology prep room, waiting for Emily's all clear. She should go check on her patients. She was about to say so when Bryce's radio, her own, not the confiscated one, clicked with an incoming transmission. The voice on the other end was not a corporal. It had the particular timbre of someone several ranks above the people currently in this corridor, and the words came out measured and deliberate, the way words get when the person saying them knows they're being recorded. Bryce, what's your status? Building is secure, sir. 9 attackers, all in custody, no staff fatalities. We have... She paused, half a second. We have significant intelligence recovered from the scene, and we have the individual who secured the building. A pause on the other end. The nurse, the voice said. Yes, sir. Another pause. Longer. I'm going to need a full brief in the morning. Whatever she has, whatever she's told you, nobody talks to anybody outside this loop until I've seen it. Understood, sir. And Bryce, the voice dropped half a register. Who the hell is she? Bryce was looking at Emily when she answered. That, she said, is currently the most important question in this building. Emily held Bryce's gaze and said nothing, and the storm pressed against the windows. And somewhere in the east corridor, one of the secured men shifted against his restraints and made a sound that was mostly just exhaustion, and the lights held steady. Her radio, the ground floor security station one, still clipped to her pocket, buzzed once. She looked down at it reflexively. The screen showed an incoming transmission on a frequency she hadn't programmed and hadn't accessed. The frequency belonged to the extraction team's handler, the one she'd spoken to. The calm, older voice. She looked at it for 1 second. The transmission wasn't audio, it was a data packet, short, compressed, the kind that a tactical field radio could send as a text string. She opened it. 4 words. You don't have everything. Emily read it twice. Her thumb hovered over the response key. The Marines were in the building. Bryce had the schematic. The 9 men were in custody. The 2nd floor was secure. You don't have everything. She looked at the string again, looked at the transmission metadata, the signal origin encoded in the packet header the way all radio transmissions encoded it, the location data that the sender had not thought to strip before sending because they'd sent it as a tactical data burst, not a voice call, and stripping metadata from a tactical burst required a step that people forgot when they were rattled. The origin point was not outside the building, it was inside it. Emily looked up from the radio and looked at the corridor around her, at the Marines moving through it, at Bryce, at the young searcher still standing behind the nursing station, and she thought about administrative access, about a scheduling system that had been accessed from inside the institution, about a cargo network that had run for 14 months through a facility's own supply chain. Someone in this hospital had been helping them, and they were still here. Someone in this hospital had been helping them, and they were still here. Emily did not say this out loud. That was the first decision, and it mattered more than it might have seemed because Bryce was 3 feet away and had just established radio contact with someone several ranks above her. And if there was a compromised source inside this building, then the information loop had to be contained before it was widened. Emily didn't know who Bryce reported to. She didn't know how deep this ran. She knew that the manifest had been used as an operational document, that the hospital's scheduling system had been accessed from inside, and that someone had just sent her a 4-word message from a position inside Arctic Point Medical Center. She clipped the radio back to her pocket, with the screen facing inward, and looked at Bryce. "I need to check on my patients," she said. "Second floor." Bryce nodded. "I'll have someone come with you." "I'm fine alone." "Carter, Lieutenant Colonel." Emily kept her voice level. "My patients have been in a locked corridor for 40 minutes during an armed incursion. One of them is post-surgical, and one is post-anesthesia. I need to assess them. I'll be faster without an escort." Bryce read something in her face. Not all of it, but enough. She held Emily's gaze for 2 seconds. 10 minutes, she said. "Then I need you back down here." Emily was already moving. She took the main stairwell this time, openly, because the building was secured and there was no longer any tactical reason to use the crawl space. She moved fast. The second-floor door opened into the back corridor and she knocked twice slowly, the way she'd told Dara, and heard the lock turn from the inside. Dara opened the door and looked at Emily with the specific expression of someone who has been holding themselves together through force of will and is now, in the presence of another person, allowing themselves to feel how hard that was. "You're okay," Dara said. It came out like a statement she was testing. "I'm okay," Emily said. "All clear downstairs. Marines are in the building." She moved past her to the patients. Rourke first. Surgical site intact, no sign of stress-related bleeding through the wound. BP elevated but within acceptable range for the circumstances. Vasquez was coming out of the anesthesia haze, confused, asking about a sound she'd heard. Emily gave her a brief and honest answer. There had been a security incident. It was resolved. She was safe. Vasquez accepted this with the mild suspicion of someone not yet fully conscious and drifted again. The 2 ground-floor nurses were in the corner. The older one, Pilar, had her arms around the younger one, a man named Garrett who'd been on staff for 6 weeks and was visibly shaking. Emily put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "You did everything right," she said, because it was true, and because he needed to hear it. She had 4 minutes left. She moved to the nursing station at the back of the corridor, which had a terminal with access to the hospital's internal administration system, the same system that governed scheduling, procurement, supply manifests, and staff records. She logged in with her credentials, opened the access log, and searched for the scheduling record that the attacker's handler had implied had been flagged. The access log showed her own records pulled from 6 days ago, a routine medication audit she'd done on the quarterly pharmaceutical order. It also showed, 14 minutes after her access, a secondary query on the same records. That query had been run from a terminal in the hospital's administrative office suite on the ground floor. It had been run under the login credentials of the facility's procurement coordinator, a man named Douglas Falk. She sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Falk. She'd interacted with him maybe a dozen times. Mid-40s, quiet, the kind of person who existed at the edge of a workplace's social geography without leaving much of an impression. He managed the supply ordering system, the vendor relationships, the shipping documentation. Everything that came into this hospital passed through his records in some form. 14 months of shipments. She closed the terminal and went back downstairs. Bryce was where she'd left her, in the east corridor, on her radio with the 2 Marines managing the secured attackers. The young last-standing searcher, she still didn't know his name, had been formally placed in custody and was sitting against the wall, wrists secured, watching the room with the focused quiet of someone mentally drafting a statement. Emily stopped beside Bryce and waited for a gap in the radio exchange. "The insider source," she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. "I know who it is." Bryce ended the transmission. "Talk." Procurement coordinator, Douglas Falk, administrative office, ground floor. He accessed the scheduling records 14 minutes after I ran a routine audit 6 days ago and flagged my record pull to whoever planned this. She kept her voice even. He's been managing the supply chain documentation for 14 months. He would have had full visibility into every shipment, every manifest, every incoming container. He's the operational anchor inside this facility. Bryce looked at her. How confident are you? Confident enough to tell you before I tell anyone else. That landed. Bryce understood what it meant. The care Emily had taken with the information loop, the reason she'd gone upstairs alone, and her expression shifted into something that was sharper and grimmer than what had been there before. Where is he now? Administrative office, or he's moved since the incursion started? He would have needed to stay close enough to monitor, but not visible enough to draw attention during the lockdown. Emily paused. He sent me a transmission on the extraction team's frequency from inside the building. He still has a tactical radio, which means he came prepared for tonight. He knew it was happening. He helped plan it, Emily said. Bryce put 2 fingers up and 2 Marines peeled away from the corridor without being told anything more specific. She had that particular command efficiency that didn't require explaining itself. I want you with me, Bryce said. I have patients. Dara can cover your patients. I need someone who can identify him on site. Bryce was already moving, and I need someone who's been in this building long enough to know where he'd go. Emily thought about Douglas Falk, the edge of the social geography. The way he took his lunch alone, usually in the administrative office, facing the window that looked out over the receiving dock at the building's east side. The receiving dock, where shipments came in. Loading dock, Emily said. East side. He'll want eyes on the dock and a clear path to the exterior if he decides to run. They moved fast, 4 of them now, Emily, Bryce, and 2 Marines, through the ground floor's service corridor. The storm was still working against the building's east face, louder on this side, the metal dock doors shuddering with each major gust. The receiving area was a large open room with rolling steel doors, a forklift, and a wall of metal shelving stacked with incoming supplies in various stages of processing. The lights were off. Not a power failure. The switch was by the interior door. Somebody had turned them off deliberately. Bryce raised a fist and they stopped. One of the Marines produced a tactical light. Emily put her hand on the Marine's arm before he clicked it on. Wait, she said. She listened. Breathing from the far right side of the room, near the dock control panel. And underneath that, barely, at the edge of audibility, the sound of fingers moving over a keypad. He was trying to open the dock door, the storm-rated exterior door that required a 6-digit code and a physical key override. He had the code. Of course he did. It was his system. But the key override was managed by facilities maintenance, and the physical key was on a hook in the maintenance office 40 feet from where he was standing. He didn't know that the facilities key had been moved 3 weeks ago when the maintenance chief had reorganized the hook board. Emily knew because she'd been in the maintenance office returning a borrowed ladder at the time and had watched him do it. The key was now in the second drawer of the maintenance chief's desk, under a stack of HVAC service records. Falk was stuck. Emily stepped forward in the dark and said, Douglas. The breathing stopped. The door won't open, she said. The key isn't at the panel. A long silence. Then his voice, and it was not the calm, older voice from the radio. That had been someone else, someone further up. It was Falk's actual voice, which she'd heard in passing maybe 12 times in 8 months, always discussing supply orders or vendor invoices, and which now had the specific texture of a man understanding that the window he'd been watching for his exit had just closed. Carter, he said. Come away from the panel, she said. The Marines behind me have lights and weapons, and they will use both. Another silence. She heard him step back from the panel. I didn't know they were going to send that many people, he said. I didn't know it was going to be... I thought it was a quiet extraction. 1 person, no incident. There were patients in this building, Emily said. I know. And something in those 2 words was not performing regret. It was the flat, collapsed sound of someone who has gotten to the other side of a decision and found it worse than they'd calculated. I know that. Bryce clicked her light on. Falk was standing 6 feet from the dock control panel, hands at his sides, a tactical radio on his belt that he hadn't reached for. He was wearing his standard administrative coordinator's badge on a lanyard. Still, like he'd forgotten to take it off when he'd decided to become something else tonight. He looked at Emily with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not defiant, not broken, quite. Something in between that had given up on performing either. "The manifests," he said. "You found them. On one of the breach team." He absorbed this. "Then it's done," he said, and his voice went quieter. "It was done when you started moving through that building. I told them that. I told them Carter would—" He stopped. "Told who?" Bryce said. Falk looked at the lieutenant colonel. Something moved across his face. "How high up does your clearance go?" "High enough," Bryce said. "No," Falk said, and his voice was careful now, in a way that was different from the earlier resignation. "I mean specifically, because the people running this, the supply chain, the transit points, the funding, they're not external contractors. They're not civilian criminals who found a military route." He paused. "They're inside. You understand what I'm saying? The people who built this operation have ranks. They have installation access. They have oversight authority over the exact systems that would catch them." The dock room went quiet except for the storm. Emily looked at Bryce. Bryce's face had gone very still in the way that faces go still when information lands that reorganizes everything around it. "Names," Bryce said. "I need assurances before—" "You are not in a position to negotiate assurances," Bryce said, and the authority in her voice was not performed. "You facilitated an armed entry into a medical facility housing active military patients. The only assurance I can offer you right now is that cooperation has historically been the factor that separates a federal sentence from a federal sentence that ends when you're 70. Falk looked at the floor. He looked at his badge on its lanyard. He said a name. Emily didn't recognize it, but Bryce did. She could tell by the way the lieutenant colonel's jaw tightened, a small and involuntary contraction, and by the way she reached immediately for her radio and then stopped, hand on the device, and did not key it. Because keying that radio meant broadcasting to the installation's communication network. The same network managed by the installation's command infrastructure. The infrastructure that included, apparently, at least one person whose name Falk had just said in a loading dock in the middle of a blizzard. Bryce lowered her hand from the radio. She looked at Emily, and Emily understood, in the specific and exhausting way she'd been understanding things tonight, one layer at a time, that they were standing in a secured room with a cooperating witness and intelligence that implicated someone with the rank and access to make it disappear a second time, and the lieutenant colonel who'd arrived to rescue the situation was now holding a radio she couldn't safely use. "Your phone," Emily said, "not the installation network. Personal device, direct to someone outside this chain. If I call outside the chain without authorization, Lieutenant Colonel," Emily's voice was quiet. "They sent 9 men into this hospital to keep this information contained. They've already made it disappear once. If you use that radio, the name he just gave you reaches the people who need it to stay buried before it reaches anyone who can act on it." Bryce held her gaze. 1 second, 2. She reached into her field jacket and pulled out her personal cell phone. The screen showed 1 bar of signal checked, barely anything, the storm and the remote location working against them. She looked at the bar, then at Emily, and Emily saw the exact moment she decided. Bryce dialed. It rang 4 times before it connected, and the voice on the other end was rough with sleep and immediate alertness, the combination that meant someone accustomed to calls in the middle of the night who never fully stopped being on duty. Bryce said 7 words. "Sir, I need a secure line, right now." She moved toward the far corner of the dock room for the call, and Emily stood in the dark with the 2 Marines and Douglas Falk in his lanyard badge, and the storm pressed against the dock doors, and the single bar of signal held. Then Bryce stopped walking. She stopped because her phone had buzzed. Not the call she was on, something else coming in simultaneously. She looked at the screen, her face changed. She turned back toward Emily, and the change in her expression was enough that one of the Marines shifted his stance without being told to. "There's a second team," Bryce said. "Not the extraction team, a cleanup unit. 3 vehicles came in from the west approach while we were focused on the north road." She looked at the Marines. "They're 2 minutes from the building." Emily looked at the dock doors. Sealed, storm-rated, key override missing. She looked at the room, the shelving, the forklift. She looked at Bryce, who was still holding a phone with 1 bar of signal and a call to someone who couldn't act in 2 minutes. They're not coming to extract, Emily said. No, Bryce said. They're not. They're not coming to extract, Emily said. No, Bryce said. They're not. The two words settled into the dock room like something physical. A cleanup unit was a different operational category from an extraction team. Extraction meant take and contain. Cleanup meant eliminate the problem at the source and remove the evidence, the manifests, the witness, the cooperating source, and anyone else in the building who'd seen enough to matter. The distinction was not subtle, and its implications were immediate. Emily looked at Bryce. How many Marines do you have in the building right now? 6 with me, plus the response team on the North Road. They're inside by now, or close. Where are the 9 from the breach team being held? East corridor, near the main entrance. Emily moved before she finished processing the full picture, because the full picture didn't require processing. It required action. She went to the dock room's interior door and looked into the service corridor. Empty. She turned back. We move Falk to the second floor with the patients. He stays there with 2 Marines. The manifests and the radio. Everything I took off the breach team goes with him, separate from his person, held by one of your people. She looked at Bryce. Your phone call. Did it connect? Connected. I gave them the name. Whether they can act before... Did they confirm receipt? Yes. Then the name is outside this building, Emily said. That's what matters. Everything else is containment. She looked at the Marines. Let's move. They moved Falk fast and without conversation, up through the stairwell to the second floor. He didn't resist and didn't speak. He'd gone into the particular stillness of someone who has fully understood the consequences of their situation and is now conserving energy for whatever comes after. Emily handed the manifest to one of the Marines, a young woman named Specialist Okafor, who took them with the careful hands of someone who'd been told they were important without being told why, and gave her straightforward instructions. Stay with the patients. Lock the corridor door. Do not open it for any reason until you hear Bryce's voice giving a specific phrase. The phrase was arbitrary. North Road is clear. Simple enough to say, specific enough that it couldn't be guessed. Back downstairs in under 3 minutes. Bryce had used the time to reposition her remaining 4 Marines, 2 at the north entrance where the breach team had entered, 2 in the east corridor with the secured attackers. She'd also raised the response team on the installation radio, which was a calculated risk given what Falk had said about the network. But the alternative was defending the building with 4 people and no backup, and that math was worse. Response team is inside, Bryce told her. 8 more, plus the team leader. They're at the north end. That's 12 Marines total. 13 including me. Emily didn't count herself in that number because she didn't have a weapon, which put her in a categorically different position from the people who did. What she had was the building, and she was going to use it. The west approach, she said. 3 vehicles. How are they coming in? Road or overland? Road, the west maintenance track. It's the only passable route on that side. She knew the west maintenance track. It ran along the building's service side and terminated at the utility entrance, a single steel door that accessed the boiler room and electrical systems. The maintenance track was also, conveniently, the narrowest vehicle approach to the building, barely wide enough for 1 vehicle at a time, flanked by the storm drainage channel on the left, and the building's foundation planting on the right. 3 vehicles on that track could not operate simultaneously. They'd have to come in sequence. Funnel point, she said. If we can hold the utility entrance and the west-facing service corridor, they can't bring more than 1 vehicle's team to bear at a time. Bryce looked at her. Not with the skepticism Emily was used to. The look that said, you're a nurse, let the adults handle this. But with the focused attention of someone weighing tactical input on its merits. We'd be splitting our force. We're already split across 3 floors. Consolidating to the west face concentrates response where the threat is coming from. Emily paused. The east corridor breach team is secured and not going anywhere. The north entrance is covered. The second floor is locked down. The threat is the west approach, and right now there's nothing between those vehicles and the utility entrance. Bryce made the call in under 10 seconds, which was one of the things Emily was going to think about later. The specific competence of someone who could assess quickly and decide without performing the assessment. 4 Marines to the west service corridor, 2 staying east, 2 on the north entrance, Bryce and Emily moving to the boiler room that connected directly to the utility entrance. They reached the boiler room at 0334. The utility entrance was a heavy steel door with a push-bar interior release and a keyed exterior lock. Emily had used this entrance twice, once during an early morning shift when the main parking was full, and once to help the maintenance chief carry a replacement pump from the supply van. She knew the door's weight, the way it resisted the push-bar in cold weather when the frame contracted, the fact that the exterior light above it had been out for 6 weeks on a replacement request that facilities kept deferring. No light meant the approach was dark. She moved to the boiler room's single east-facing window, a narrow horizontal slot near the ceiling designed for ventilation rather than visibility, and climbed on the service step to look through it. The window gave a restricted view of the west maintenance track, enough to see the approach. Headlights. 2 sets, moving slow. The third vehicle was behind them, invisible at this distance, or possibly staged further back. "They're here," she said. Bryce was beside her. She relayed the position to her Marines over radio and then went quiet, and they both watched the headlights come. The vehicles stopped 50 meters out, engines cut, the headlights went dark. That was the first thing that was wrong. A cleanup unit coming in fast and confident didn't stop 50 meters out and cut their lights. That was a probe move, checking for response, seeing if the sudden darkness drew any reaction from the building. They knew the Marines were here. The North Road approach, the vehicles in the parking structure, the lights in the building, any of it could have been observed from a distance and relayed. They were adjusting. Emily stepped down from the service step. "They know we're positioned," she said quietly. "They're not rushing." "They don't need to rush," Bryce said. "They just need the building eventually." "What they need," Emily said, "is the manifests and Falk. That's the mission." She thought about the forward transmission. "You don't have everything." The handler saying that before the cleanup unit had even arrived. Not to threaten, she realized now, but to stall. To keep her attention on what she'd found while the second piece of the operation moved into position. They were never going to come in through the west at full force. That's the visible play. They wanted us watching the west. She looked at the boiler room's ceiling, at the utility conduit runs that crossed it, east to west, and the access ladder bolted to the north wall that led up to the mechanical chase running above the building's service level. The same mechanical chase system she'd used earlier tonight. And the north entrance, the one with 2 Marines on it, the one nobody was watching closely because the visible threat was the west approach. She grabbed Bryce's arm. "North entrance, pull one team from the west corridor to the north, now. They're splitting our attention." Bryce didn't argue. She keyed her radio. She was mid-transmission when the north entrance door came open. Not by force, not by breach, but by key. Someone with authorized access to the building's exterior key system, the kind of access that a procurement coordinator who managed facility vendor relationships might have arranged over 14 months of quiet preparation. A secondary key. Cut and distributed before tonight. The 2 Marines on the north entrance responded immediately and professionally, which meant the situation at the north entrance was loud and physical and fast. And while it was loud, the west utility entrance opened. The exterior lock turned from outside with a key that matched the same distribution, and the first of the cleanup unit came through into the boiler room. Emily was already behind the boiler. There were 3 of them through the utility entrance, moving in the careful way of people who expected resistance and were trying to locate it before engaging. The boiler room was loud. The machinery ran continuously and covered the sounds of movement in a way the rest of the building didn't. Emily had noted this the first time she'd come through here. The 3 men had noted it too, probably, which was why they were moving visually rather than by sound. She didn't have a weapon. She had a boiler room. The boiler room contained 3 natural gas-fired boiler units, each the size of a small car, connected by insulated pipe runs to the building's heating system. A bank of electrical panels on the south wall, the service step she'd used at the window, 2 wheeled equipment carts left by the maintenance crew, a fire suppression system with manual activation at the east panel, and a chemical storage cabinet for the boiler's water treatment system, padlocked, but with the combination written on a piece of tape on the inside of the adjacent cabinet, because someone had decided that was easier than remembering it, the kind of casual security failure that existed in every facility everywhere. She knew all of this because she'd been in this room twice, and she looked at rooms. She opened the unlocked adjacent cabinet, read the combination off the tape, opened the chemical storage cabinet, and read the labels in the dark by feel. Boiler descaler, corrosive, aerosolized if heated, not useful right now. pH adjuster, same issue. Water softener salt, useless. And at the back, a sealed container of boiler system leak tracer dye, which came in a pressurized aerosol format for application in confined pipe spaces, and which, in sufficient concentration, was a highly effective mucous membrane irritant. She took it. The first man came around the east side of the center boiler unit. Emily was on the west side. She moved along the pipe run, keeping the boiler mass between them. And when the second man came around the west side, she had already moved north and was behind the equipment cart. The third man had positioned himself at the utility entrance, covering the exit. Smart. They'd done this before. She looked at the distance between her position and the electrical panel, 12 feet, open floor, not crossable without being seen. She looked at the fire suppression activation panel, 6 feet, partially obscured by the pipe run on the south wall. She threw the aerosol container, not at any of the three men, at the far north corner of the boiler room, where it hit the concrete wall and clattered and rolled and produced the exact kind of misdirectional sound that drew eyes. All three drew eyes for the 2 seconds it took Emily to reach the fire suppression panel and pull the manual activation. The suppression system in the boiler room was CO2 rather than water. Water and electrical panels and gas systems didn't combine well, so the facility had installed a clean agent system. The activation flooded the room with CO2 discharge in approximately 4 seconds. Cold, dense, and in the boiler room's enclosed space, immediately vision obscuring. Emily had taken one full breath before she pulled the handle. She held it. She moved through this discharge toward the electrical panel by memory. 12 feet, 2 obstacles, southeast corner, and hit the main circuit breaker for the building's west service section. The lights in the boiler room, already dim, went out. The machinery went quiet. The CO2 discharge filled the sudden silence with a rushing white noise. She had approximately 25 seconds of held breath left. She moved back toward the utility entrance where the third man had been positioned, staying below the CO2 concentration layer, which settled denser at knee height. Someone was coughing. Someone else was moving without direction. She found the utility entrance door by feel and pulled it open. Outside, the maintenance track, dark, cold, storms still pushing hard from the northwest. She exhaled and breathed and moved east along the building's exterior wall. Around the building's corner, the north entrance situation had resolved. She could see it from here. Both Marines were on their feet. The unauthorized entry had been stopped and secured. Bryce was at the north entrance with her radio giving instructions that Emily couldn't fully hear over the wind. 2 of the West Corridor Marines were moving toward the north side. The remaining cleanup unit members, the vehicles had held at least 8 total, she estimated, based on the 3 vehicles and standard team sizing, were somewhere between the maintenance track and the utility entrance, which currently had CO2 venting from it and no lights. The operation had lost its clean entry point. The element of surprise, which they'd had for about 90 seconds, was gone. Emily came around to the north entrance and found Bryce. Bryce looked at her. At the fact that she'd come from the exterior, from the direction of the west face, in the middle of a blizzard, in scrubs, and had the grace not to ask the obvious question. 3 in the boiler room, Emily said. CO2 suppression activated. Lights out on the west service circuit. They'll be out of the room in under a minute, but they'll be disoriented. We have 2 more from the north key entry, Bryce said. Secured. The vehicles on the maintenance track, they'll pull back when the entry teams don't report success. They need the building to be accessible. Then we make sure it's not. Bryce keyed her radio, pulled 2 Marines from the east corridor, and repositioned them to cover the utility entrance from the exterior. Outside, in the storm, using the building's northwest corner for cover. It was not a comfortable position. Neither Marine said anything about that. The next 11 minutes were ugly in the way that real situations were ugly. Not dramatic, not clean, but grinding and incremental and full of small decisions that mattered more than they looked like they should. 2 of the cleanup team from the boiler room came out the utility entrance into the waiting Marines. One tried the building's west maintenance window and found it locked from inside. One simply sat down on the maintenance track in the blizzard, which turned out to be a man who'd taken enough CO2 exposure that his coordination was significantly impaired, and who was going to need medical evaluation before anyone interrogated him. Emily assessed him herself because he was technically on her building's doorstep, and she was still, through all of this, a nurse. Oxygen saturation low but not critical, pulse elevated. He was conscious and coherent enough to be scared, which was a positive neurological sign. "Breathe slowly," she told him, kneeling in the snow. "You're going to be okay." He looked at her. He was probably 30 years old. He had the kind of face that hadn't signed up for this exact scenario when it made whatever choices had led here. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was rough from the CO2. "I'm the nurse," Emily said. By 0412, the exterior was secured. The 3 vehicles on the maintenance track had not moved. The drivers, it turned out, had been instructed to hold position and wait for the entry team's signal, and when no signal came, they'd sat in their vehicles in the blizzard for 38 minutes before Bryce's Marines walked up on both sides simultaneously, and that was that. 14 additional members of the cleanup unit in custody, bringing the total to 23 people in the building or on its immediate grounds who had no legitimate reason to be there. The storm had peaked and was dropping. The first gray light of an Arctic dawn was a theoretical possibility somewhere behind the cloud cover, still hours away but approaching. Emily sat on a supply crate in the east corridor outside the nursing station and let herself feel how tired she was for approximately 4 minutes. Dara came down from the second floor and found her there. "Rourke's asking what the noise was," Dara said. "Tell him there was a security drill. He's a Marine, he's not going to believe that." "Tell him anyway." Emily pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. Her shoulder was producing a specific and insistent complaint that she'd been ignoring for 2 hours. The cut on her knuckle had dried closed, but was going to need proper cleaning. She was also, she realized, extremely cold, having spent portions of the last 40 minutes outside in sub-zero temperatures and scrubs. "How's Vasquez?" Fully awake now, and very confused. "She keeps asking about the helicopter." "What helicopter?" Dara looked at her. "Exactly. There wasn't one. But she says she heard rotors." Emily lifted her head. Rotors. The building had been loud and chaotic, and the storm had been providing constant noise cover, but rotors had a specific frequency that penetrated building structure differently than wind. She stood up. "When?" she said. She said maybe 20 minutes ago. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming. Emily was already moving toward the window at the end of the east corridor, which faced north and had a partial view of the installation approach and the open ground between the hospital and the tree line. There was a helicopter on the ground a quarter-mile out, dark painted, rotors still, no lights. It had come in during the cleanup unit engagement, when everyone's attention was west and north. And it was not a Marine installation helicopter. The tail configuration was wrong. She found Bryce in the main corridor on her radio, coordinating the custody processing of the 23 detainees. She put her hand on Bryce's arm without apology. "There's a helicopter on the north ground, quarter-mile. Dark, no lights. Came in during the engagement." Bryce's radio went down. She looked at Emily. "That's not one of ours," she said. It wasn't a question. "No. It's him," Bryce said. "The name Falk gave us. If he knew the cleanup unit was compromised, he came himself," Emily said. The weight of it settled between them. Whoever this was, the name she still didn't recognize but Bryce had, the name that had made the lieutenant colonel's jaw tighten, had watched his extraction team fail and his cleanup unit fail, and had decided that the only remaining option was personal intervention, which meant he had enough at stake to be here, in person, in a dark helicopter, at 4 a.m. in a blizzard in Alaska. That was not the behavior of someone on the operational periphery. That was the behavior of someone who knew exactly what the manifest contained and what their existence meant for him specifically. Bryce raised her radio and gave a 4-word instruction to her team leader, North Perimeter, immediate. Then she looked at Emily. "He'll have come with protection. How many could fit in that helicopter? Configuration like that, pilot plus 4 comfortably. 6 if they're willing to be uncomfortable." "He'll be willing," Emily said. "Everyone he's sent tonight has failed. He'll want people around him." "He's also trapped," Bryce said. "The North Road is covered. The storm's coming back up. That helicopter is not lifting off in the next 2 hours. He came here because he thought the cleanup unit would handle it and he could walk into a cleared building. She paused. He didn't know you were here. Emily thought about that. 3 years of quiet posting. 3 years of being the nurse who filed a report that went nowhere and got transferred to the edge of the continent as a consequence. 3 years of being, in operational terms, managed, contained, strategically irrelevant. They had not known she was here, not in the way that mattered. They'd known her name was on a scheduling report and that she'd accessed records that could eventually lead somewhere inconvenient, and they'd sent a team to retrieve her as a precaution. But they had not known, whoever was sitting in that dark helicopter a quarter-mile away had not known what she actually was, what she could do, what she'd already done tonight. 3 years of being underestimated by people who thought they knew exactly what a nurse looked like. He's going to try to negotiate, Emily said. When the perimeter closes, he's going to want to talk. He has rank and he has lawyers, and he's going to believe that the name and the rank are enough to create enough institutional confusion to give him time to build a defense. He might be right about the institutional confusion, Bryce said carefully. He's not right about the time, Emily said, because the phone call you made went outside this network, and the name is already in the hands of whoever you called, and that person is... She stopped. Who did you call? Bryce held her gaze for a moment. My counterpart at the Defense Intelligence Field Office in Anchorage, she said. Someone I've known for 11 years who is not part of any installation command structure and who has been running a parallel inquiry into the supply chain anomalies for the past 6 months. Emily absorbed this. They've been building toward this, she said. They had everything except the transit hub and the internal source, Bryce said. Falk and the manifests are the 2 pieces they couldn't find. She paused. You handed them both in one night. Outside, the north perimeter was moving. Emily could hear the radio traffic. Clipped, coordinated, Marines establishing positions in a closing arc around the helicopter's landing point. The dark aircraft sat on the open ground north of the hospital, rotors still, and whatever was happening inside it was invisible from here. The radio on Bryce's hip crackled. Her team leader's voice. Contact made. Individual inside the aircraft is requesting to speak with the commanding officer on scene. He's using a rank designation, says he outranks everyone present. Bryce looked at Emily. Something in her expression was not quite satisfaction and not quite anger. The specific feeling of someone watching a years-long structure begin to come apart at the points it was always going to fail. She keyed her radio. Tell him the commanding officer will be there shortly. She lowered the radio. I want you with me. I'm a nurse, Emily said. I'm not. You're the reason I have anything to bring to that aircraft, Bryce said. You're coming. They walked the quarter-mile in the dark, in the wind, across the open ground north of the hospital. 2 Marines ahead, 2 behind. The helicopter grew from a dark shape to a specific aircraft as they approached, and the door was open, and a man was standing in the doorway with the kind of posture that had spent decades being the most important person in every room. Emily didn't know his face. She'd seen his name on Bryce's expression, and that was all she'd had. He looked at Bryce first, and the look was calculating, assessing rank, leverage, institutional relationship, whether any of this could still be managed. Then he looked at Emily. The calculation changed. She could see it change. He was looking at scrubs, at a split knuckle, at a woman who had walked across a dark field in a blizzard after the night she'd apparently just had, and the thing behind his eyes was shifting from calculation into something that was making a rapid and unpleasant reassessment of the night's events. You're Carter, he said. Yes, she said. You're the nurse. She held his gaze and said nothing, and in the silence the wind came through hard from the northwest, and the Marines held their positions, and the Arctic pre-dawn hung over all of it, dark and absolute. I want counsel present before any... Brigadier General Harlan Voss, Bryce said, and the name in the open air, said aloud, with witnesses and recording equipment on every Marine present, had a finality to it that silenced him mid-sentence. You are being detained in connection with an investigation into weapons trafficking facilitated through military medical supply infrastructure. You have the right to remain silent. She kept going, the full recitation, formal and procedural, and Voss stood in the helicopter doorway and listened to it with the expression of a man watching something he built over years come apart in the space of a single pre-dawn field.
Emily watched his face through the whole of it. When Bryce finished, Voss looked at Emily again. Not at Bryce, at Emily. "You had no idea what you were looking at," he said, "when you pulled those records 6 days ago." "No," she said. "I was checking a medication discrepancy." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 6 days ago, you didn't know any of this existed, and tonight you—" He stopped. He looked at the Marines around the helicopter, at Bryce with her radio and her formal recitation, at the hospital lit up behind them. "How did you handle 9 operators? You've been out for 3 years." Emily thought about the crawl space, the fire suppression panel, the aerosol container, the CO2, the boiler room in the dark. "I know my building," she said. Voss stepped down from the helicopter without being told to, which was the first intelligent decision he'd made all night, and the Marines moved in, and that was the operational end of it. He had 4 people with him in the aircraft, personal security, all of whom came down with their hands visible rather than try anything in the open ground with 6 Marines and a closing perimeter. Bryce was on her radio immediately, calling it in, the formal notification chain that would wake people in Anchorage and Washington before the sun came up over Iron Creek. Emily stood on the open ground and let the wind hit her and breathed cold air and looked at the hospital. The lights were on. All of them, full building, the kind of lit-up-at-night brightness that meant people were awake and moving inside and alive. She was going to have to go back in there. There were patients to assess, a post-CO2 exposure detainee who genuinely needed oxygen monitoring, documentation to complete that was going to be unlike any incident report she'd ever written, and Rourke on the second floor who was not going to accept the security drill explanation for much longer and deserved a better answer than that anyway. She turned to go back. Bryce touched her arm, stopping her. "Carter." She waited until Emily turned. "The DIA office in Anchorage, when they debrief you, and they will probably starting tomorrow, there's going to be a significant amount of institutional interest in your background, your field record, the report you filed 3 years ago, all of it." She paused. "I want you to know that whatever that process looks like, the account of what happened in this building tonight goes into the record as I observed it, without modification, without simplification." Emily looked at her. "I'm telling you," Bryce said, "because people are going to want to write a version of this that emphasizes the Marine response and the DIA investigation, and positions you as a peripheral element who had the good sense to shelter in place." A pause. "I will not be writing that version." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And then, because honesty seemed warranted, "It probably won't matter. Institutions write the versions they need." "Sometimes," Bryce said. "This time I don't think they'll have that option. There are 23 witnesses in your building who watched a nurse in scrubs walk through a 9-person armed assault and hold the facility until the cavalry arrived." She almost smiled. "That's a hard story to revise." Emily thought about that on the walk back across the open ground, the wind pushing at her back now like it was helping. She thought about Voss's face when he'd looked at her. The reassessment she'd watched happen behind his eyes. The specific quality of being seen, finally and fully, and too late for anyone to undo it, by someone who'd spent years calculating exactly how invisible she was supposed to be. She was almost back to the hospital entrance when her radio, the one she'd been carrying all night, the ground floor security station one, still clipped to her pocket, buzzed a final time. She looked at the screen. It was not a transmission. It was a data notification from the hospital's internal administrative system, pushed to all department heads and senior staff. A routine notification, the kind that went out automatically when certain administrative records were accessed or modified. The notification said that at 0418 this morning, an external access to Arctic Point Medical Center's payroll and human resources database had been detected and flagged. An external access that had occurred 15 minutes ago, while Voss was in the helicopter, while Bryce was on her radio, while Emily was walking across an open field in the dark. From a source the notification identified only as Offsite Administrative Terminal, Authorization Pending Verification. Someone else had been in the system. Someone who wasn't Falk, wasn't Voss, wasn't any of the 23 people currently in custody. Someone who had used the window of chaos to access the hospital's HR records.
Not the manifests, not the supply chain documentation, but the personnel files. Specifically, according to the notification's access log, one personnel file. Hers. Emily stood at the hospital entrance and read the notification twice and felt something that wasn't fear but was adjacent to it. The specific sensation of understanding that the thing you thought you'd finished is not finished, that the structure is larger than the pieces you've seen, that the night is not over in the way you thought it was over. She thought about Voss looking at her across the open ground. I want counsel present before any... He'd stopped mid-sentence, not because Bryce had interrupted him. He'd stopped himself, as if he'd been about to say something and changed his mind. She went back through the hospital entrance and found Bryce at the east corridor. Someone accessed my personnel file, Emily said. Offsite. 18 minutes ago. Bryce went very still. Voss didn't come here to manage the situation, Emily said. He came here because he needed to know something specific, something he couldn't get from the manifest or from Falk. She looked at Bryce. He came here to find out what's in my service record, the classified portion, the part that explains why he should have been more afraid of me 3 years ago. Bryce was already on her radio. Whatever's in that record, Emily said, and her voice was level and cold and very quiet. Someone just got access to it, and I need to know who, because if there's a fourth piece of this operation that I haven't seen yet, if there's someone else who knows what I know about that cache, about the report, about what I saw in the field 3 years ago. We'll find them, Bryce said. You don't understand, Emily said. I need to know now. Because if they have that record, they have my emergency contacts, my family's location, my home address downstate. Everything that tells someone who's desperate and still operational exactly where to apply pressure when they can't get to me directly. Bryce stopped mid-transmission. She looked at Emily with the expression of someone who has just understood that the situation they thought they'd resolved has a dimension they hadn't accounted for. And Emily's personal phone, the one in the drawer of the nursing station, the one she almost never checked on shift because personal phones were a distraction and she'd learned years ago to be reachable by the right people through the right channels, began to ring. She ran for the nursing station, not a jog, not a fast walk. She ran because the phone had been ringing for 4 seconds, and every second mattered when the people who just accessed her personnel file were the kind of people who moved quickly once they decided to move. Bryce was behind her, already talking into her radio, already escalating. Emily hit the nursing station drawer, pulled it open, grabbed the phone. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize. Area code from downstate. Not a contact she had saved. She answered. Carter. A woman's voice. Clipped, direct, not panicked. My name is Special Agent Renata Souza, Defense Intelligence Agency, Anchorage Field Office. Lieutenant Colonel Bryce called me approximately 40 minutes ago. I've been running the parallel inquiry, she mentioned. Emily's hand was tight around the phone. Why are you calling my personal number? Because I'm the one who flagged the unauthorized access to your personnel file, and I need you to know what was taken before you hear it from someone else. A brief pause. Not hesitation. More like a woman who was choosing her words with the precision of someone who'd spent years doing exactly that. The access pulled your full service record, including the classified annex. Specifically, the section documenting your role in the forward operating base supply audit that preceded your complaint 3 years ago. Who accessed it? We're tracing now. The terminal origin is a civilian administrative address outside the installation network. Someone who had pre-positioned access credentials before tonight started. This wasn't improvised. Another pause. There's a fourth person involved in the operations command structure. Not Voss, not Falk, not the handler who ran the breach team. Someone who's been in a civilian administrative oversight role with enough institutional access to have watched the DIA inquiry develop in real time. Emily thought about the inquiry Bryce had described. 6 months of parallel investigation, building toward the transit hub and the internal source. Building slowly, carefully, through official channels. Official channels that someone in a civilian oversight position could have monitored. They knew about your investigation, Emily said. We believe they've known for at least 3 months, Souza said, which means tonight wasn't entirely reactive. The decision to extract you was accelerated by your records pull 6 days ago, but the contingency plan,
including the personnel file access, was already in place. They wanted your service record because it documents what you observed in the field.
The specific cache location, the serial numbers you recorded, evidence that predates everything we've built in the last 6 months, and that would survive any attempt to suppress the newer intelligence. They wanted to know what I could prove independently, Emily said. And now they know, which means whoever this fourth person is, they have a complete picture of your evidentiary value. Sousa's voice was even. We need to move fast on the trace. I'm calling because I want you to know this isn't over and I don't want you caught off guard. Emily looked up from the nursing station. Bryce was in the corridor 5 feet away, listening, her expression confirming what Sousa was saying without saying it. How long for the trace? Emily said. Best case, 90 minutes. Worst case, they've already sanitized the origin point. Sousa paused one more time, and this pause had a different quality. Something that was not quite personal, but was adjacent to it. Carter, the record we pulled when we were cross-referencing the inquiry, your original complaint, the intake record, the one that was supposed to have been altered. It was altered. I was told the review found no substantive. The alteration was incomplete, Sousa said. Someone started the modification and didn't finish it. There's a metadata timestamp on the original version that shows it was received, logged, and flagged as significant before the suppression attempt began. The original is intact in a backup archive that the person doing the alteration didn't know existed. A beat. Your report was never lost, Carter. It was buried. There's a difference. The buried thing is still there. Emily sat down on the edge of the nursing station chair. She hadn't meant to sit down. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. 3 years. 3 years of believing that the complaint had dissolved into institutional indifference, that the review had found nothing because there was nothing to find, or because the people reviewing it had decided there was nothing to find, which amounted to the same outcome either way. 3 years of telling herself that the transfer was consequence and not calculation, that she'd done what she could, that the world was large and slow and not always interested in justice on a convenient timeline. The report was intact. I'll need a formal statement from you within the next 48 hours, Sousa said. Everything from tonight, everything you recovered from the scene, and everything you know about what you observed 3 years ago. Can you do that? Yes, Emily said. Good. Sousa's voice shifted slightly. Still professional, but with something underneath it that wasn't policy. For what it's worth. What you did tonight. The building, the people in it, the evidence you preserved. We would not have Voss without the manifests. We would not have a viable case without Falk's cooperation. And Falk cooperated because you gave him a reason to. You didn't just survive tonight. You built something we can prosecute. Emily didn't say anything. 90 minutes, Sousa said. I'll call when we have the trace. The line went dead. The east corridor was quiet. Bryce was looking at her. The Marine at the corridor's north end was looking at the wall, professionally, the way good soldiers look at walls when a conversation is not their business. Emily set the phone down. The fourth person, Bryce said. Sousa's tracing them. 90 minutes is a long time. I know. Emily looked at the corridor around her. The scuff marks on the linoleum from the night's movement. The supply cart someone had pushed aside during the initial chaos and never returned to its position. The overhead light at the corridor's far end that had been flickering since October and was still flickering now. Her hospital, looking like itself. I'm going to go check on my patients while we wait. Bryce looked like she wanted to say something about that and then decided not to. Emily went upstairs. The second floor was a different world from the ground floor. Quieter, smaller, the contained atmosphere of a ward that had spent a frightening night locked in a back corridor and was now cautiously returning to its normal geography. Dara had gotten the patients back to their beds. She documented everything. Emily could see the notation timestamps on the chart system when she logged in at the nursing station. Every 15 minutes through the lockdown, Dara's handwriting in the electronic notes, precise and complete even during the worst of it. That was the kind of person Dara Osi was, and Emily had not told her that enough. She went to Rourke first. He was sitting up in bed with his arms crossed, which was not great for his surgical site and which he clearly did not care about. All right, he said when Emily came in. Real answer. What happened? She told him the short version. Not all of it. Some of it was not hers to tell, and some of it was going to be in federal documentation before the week was out, and she wasn't going to get ahead of that. But enough. Armed incursion, facility secured, investigation ongoing. She watched his face go through several things in quick succession. You handled it, he said. It was not quite a question. The Marines handled it, she said, which was partially true. He looked at her the way people look at someone when they know they're getting a partial answer and have decided to accept it for now. My nurses at Pendleton used to hide behind the physicians whenever we had a drill, he said. Just so you know. For context. This wasn't a drill, Emily said. No kidding. He was quiet for a moment. My charts, my records, they're secure? The patient data? She hadn't thought about that in the past 20 minutes, and she should have. I'll confirm with administration when the lockdown's fully lifted. If there's any indication of records access, we notify every patient individually. She made the note in her head and meant it. He nodded. She checked his wound. The surgical site was clean, no sign of the stress-related complications she'd been watching for, which was good, because Rourke had a specific gift for not telling anyone when something was wrong, and she'd been bracing for a discovered problem since the night began. His vitals were elevated but trending down. He was going to be fine. Hey, he said, as she was updating his chart. She looked up. Thank you, he said. And the way he said it, not the automatic social courtesy of thanks for the refill, but something that came from a different place, weighted with the specific gratitude of someone who understands what being kept safe actually cost, made her look at him for a moment before she answered. That's the job, she said. It's more than the job, he said. And you know it. She didn't argue with him. She finished the chart and moved on. Vasquez was awake and oriented and had questions that Emily answered honestly within the bounds of what she knew and what she was authorized to say. Garrett, the 6-week staff member who'd been shaking in the corner of the back corridor, had recovered enough to be embarrassed about the shaking, which Emily addressed directly. She told him that shaking was a physiological response to adrenaline and stress and was not an indicator of weakness or failure, and that anyone who told him otherwise had never been in an actually frightening situation. He looked like he didn't entirely believe her. She told him he would, eventually. Pilar, the 11-year veteran, was at the medication cart doing the morning drug count, which was not technically required for another 2 hours, and which she was doing anyway because she needed something routine to hold on to, and the medication count was the most routine thing in her professional world. Emily stood beside her for a moment without speaking. You've done this before, Pilar said. Not accusing, observing, the way someone with 11 years of reading people observes. A long time ago, Emily said. Pilar counted a tray of medication cups and checked them against the log. I've been a nurse for 22 years, she said. I've worked with a lot of people who were exceptional at their jobs and knew it, and a lot of people who were exceptional and didn't make a thing of it. She put the tray back. You're the second kind. Emily didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one. Sousa called back in 73 minutes. Emily was in the medication storage room cleaning the cut on her knuckle properly. Soap, irrigation, wound closure strip, the basic competence of someone who'd been treating other people's injuries all night and had finally turned the attention to her own, when the phone rang. We have the trace, Sousa said. Civilian Oversight, Deputy Director of Medical Logistics, Regional Command. Name is Harold Greer. 61 years old, 23 years in the position, full visibility into every medical supply contract and procurement audit across 9 installations, including this one. A pause. He's been the administrative backstop for the entire operation. Voss ran the military side. Greer managed the procurement documentation. Every anomalous shipment that should have triggered an audit flag, he suppressed it. He knew about my report 3 years ago, Emily said. He was on the review board, Sousa said flatly. He was one of the 3 people who determined there was no substantive finding. He was sitting on the board that buried your complaint while actively facilitating the operation your complaint was about. The medication storage room was very quiet. Where is he now? Emily said. Taken into custody 40 minutes ago at his home. DIA, field agents, and federal marshals. He didn't run. I don't think he believed it was coming this fast. A pause. He asked, when they came to the door, whether the nurse had talked. That was his first question. Not his lawyer, not his rights. Whether the nurse had talked. Emily looked at the wound closure strip on her knuckle. Neat, clean, functional. What did they tell him? She said. They told him it was a bit more than that, Sousa said, and for the first time in the conversation, there was something in her voice that was not strictly professional, something that was simply human and satisfied. Carter, with Greer in custody, we have the complete structure. Voss, Falk, the breach and cleanup teams, Greer, the transit point documentation, the original complaint record, the manifests. The case is solid. My office is filing with the federal prosecutor in Anchorage this morning. The personnel file access, Emily said. My service record. We recovered the data trail before it could be transmitted further. It went from the access terminal to a staging server and stopped there. Greer didn't have time to move it before his door opened. Sousa paused. Your information is contained. Your emergency contacts, your family's location, none of it went further than a server we now control. Emily exhaled. It was not a dramatic breath. It was the slow, complete release of something she'd been holding for 73 minutes without letting herself know how tightly she was holding it. One more thing, Sousa said. Your original report, the one from 3 years ago. It's going into the formal record as the origin document for this entire case. You'll be cited as the originating source. That's going to be public, eventually, not immediately, but when the prosecutions move forward, your name is going to be attached to this in a way that isn't peripheral. I understand, Emily said. It means the people who transferred you, who managed you, who spent 3 years calculating that you were contained, their decisions are going to be part of the record too. The administrative maneuvering, the suppressed review, all of it. A beat. I want to make sure you're prepared for that. Emily thought about Iron Creek, about the transfer she'd accepted without fighting because fighting it had seemed pointless, because she'd told herself that she could do good work anywhere and that the posting didn't define the work. She'd been right about that, as it turned out. She'd just been wrong about why she was there. I've been prepared for that for 3 years, she said. I just didn't know it yet. The formal proceedings began 9 days later in Anchorage. Emily gave her statement to Sousa's team across 2 full days in a federal building conference room, working through everything in chronological order. The forward operating base, the cache, the report, the transfer, and then the compressed and violent hours of a single night in Iron Creek. The DIA attorneys were thorough and not unkind. They asked her to repeat certain sections multiple times, and she did, without impatience, because she understood that precision mattered and that the difference between a prosecutable case and a dismissed one often lived in the quality of the foundational testimony. Voss retained a legal team that filed 3 separate motions in the first week, all of which were denied. The federal prosecutor described the evidentiary package as among the most complete she'd worked with in 17 years of prosecuting cases involving institutional corruption. Greer did not retain counsel immediately. He spent 4 days apparently believing that the institutional weight of his position would generate some form of intervention that did not materialize. Falk cooperated fully. His statement ran to 80 pages and named 7 additional individuals across 3 installations who had been involved in the supply chain operation in various capacities. 3 of them were charged. 2 accepted plea agreements before the month was out. The operation's financial structure, the accounts, the movement of funds, the shell companies used to layer the trafficking revenue, was unwound over the following weeks by a team of federal financial investigators who described it in dry official language as sophisticated but ultimately traceable once the transit documentation existed. The transit documentation existed because Emily had gone back through a dark building for it. None of this was clean or quick or satisfying in the way that resolutions looked in the version of events where everything resolved on a schedule. There were continuances and motions and weeks of silence in which Emily was simply back at Arctic Point Medical Center, working her shifts, checking her patients, doing the job. Rourke was discharged 2 weeks after the incident and shook her hand at the door with the grip of someone who meant it. Vasquez recovered fully and sent a card from downstate that said, in handwriting that suggested she'd rewritten it at least twice, that she didn't entirely know what had happened that night, but that she knew she was alive because of it. Garrett stopped shaking. He turned out to be a good nurse. Careful, patient, not in a hurry to prove himself, which was the right instinct for this kind of work. Emily told him so directly one morning in the medication room, and he looked simultaneously embarrassed and genuinely glad to hear it. Dara renewed her contract. She told Emily this on a Tuesday, 2 months after the incident, standing at the nursing station doing exactly what she'd been doing the night everything happened, updating charts, half watching the weather on the window, with the particular settled quality of someone who has decided that the place they are is, against earlier expectations, the place they want to be. "I thought you weren't staying," Emily said. "I thought you were just a nurse," Dara said. And then catching herself, "That came out wrong." "It came out exactly right," Emily said. "That was the point." Dara looked at her for a moment, deciding whether to push further, and then decided not to, which was one of the things Emily had come to appreciate about her. She understood when a thing was complete. The formal military recognition came in the 4th month. It was not a ceremony in the grand sense. No public hall, no press, no audience of strangers. It was held in the hospital's main corridor, the same corridor where the emergency doors had come open and everything had begun, cleared of its supply carts and its usual foot traffic, with the staff of Arctic Point Medical and the Marines currently assigned to the installation gathered along its length on a Thursday afternoon when the storm season had finally broken, and the sky outside the north windows was the particular hard blue of an Arctic spring. Lieutenant Colonel Bryce was there. She'd driven up from the installation specifically, which said something about the choice she'd made to attend rather than send a commendation by mail. Sousa's office sent a representative, say a junior agent named Patel, who carried himself with the slightly overwhelmed manner of someone who had read the case file and was reconciling it with the woman in scrubs standing at the front of the corridor. Dr. Marchand stood near the back, because he was still on duty and had 2 patients to check in 20 minutes, but had carved out the time in between. He had not spoken to Emily directly about the night since she'd cut his zip ties in the radiology prep room and told him to lock the door, but he'd left a written note in her staff mailbox 3 weeks after, which said, "I've been practicing medicine for 27 years, and I've never been wrong about a person as completely as I was wrong about you. I intend to do better." She had read it twice, thrown it away, and thought about it more than she'd thrown it away to suggest. Bryce read the formal recognition aloud. Military language, precise and official, citing specific actions in specific sequence. It was accurate. It was also, in the way that formal language was always somewhat inadequate to the thing it described, incomplete. But Emily had stopped expecting completeness from official documents 3 years ago, and the incompleteness didn't diminish the document's weight. When Bryce finished, the corridor was quiet for a moment. Then Rourke, who was not there, who was 2,000 miles away in a rehabilitation facility on the East Coast, had apparently coordinated with someone, because the Marine standing at the corridor's midpoint produced a phone and pressed play on a voice memo that Rourke had recorded and sent down the chain specifically for this occasion. His voice in the corridor, "I spent 8 years being told that the most dangerous thing in a forward environment was the person with the weapon. Turns out I was wrong. The most dangerous thing is the person who knows the building better than you do and has a reason to fight. Carter had both. The Marines in that facility are alive because of her. I'm one of them. That's the whole statement." The recording ended. Someone near the back made the particular sound of a person trying to be quiet about the fact that they are not entirely composed. Bryce turned to Emily and held out the formal commendation in its folder. Emily took it with both hands, which was the appropriate formal response, and also because her hands were not entirely steady, which she had not anticipated and was not going to pretend otherwise. "On behalf of the installation and the investigation team," Bryce said, and then paused and departed from whatever formal language she'd prepared. "You kept everyone alive, all of them. The patients who didn't know they were in danger, the staff who were terrified, the Marines who were outpositioned." She held Emily's gaze. "You kept them alive, and then you handed us a case that's going to put people away for decades and dismantle a network that's been running for 2 years. Both things. You did both things." She paused. "Not the nurse who happened to have a background. The nurse. That was why you fought. That was why you knew the building. That was the whole of it." Emily looked at the commendation in her hands. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in a stairwell in the dark 3 years ago and filed a report and then been told, in bureaucratic language that was technically neutral and actually crushing, that the report had found no substantive basis for action. She thought about the version of herself who had accepted a transfer to the edge of the continent and told herself it was fine, that she could do good work anywhere, that the work was the thing and the recognition was not the point. That version of herself had not been wrong. The work was the thing. She still believed that. But she also understood, standing in this corridor on a Thursday in April with the Arctic sky blue and hard through the north windows, that being seen was not the same as needing to be seen. You could do work that mattered in the dark for years and be right to do it, and still be allowed to stand in the light when it finally reached you. Those weren't contradictions. They were just the full shape of a life that hadn't finished yet. "Thank you," she said to Bryce. 2 words, direct, without qualification. Bryce nodded. And then, because she was a person who understood when a thing was complete, stepped back. The staff dispersed slowly, the way people do when the formal part of something is over and they're not entirely ready to go back to ordinary. Marchand slipped out first to his patients. Patel from Souza's office shook Emily's hand and said something professional that she responded to professionally and that both of them understood was not the point of his being there. Dara stood at the nursing station doorway with her arms crossed and her expression doing the specific thing it did when she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. She said it. "You know what's funny?" Dara said. "I spent 4 months here thinking you were difficult." "I am difficult," Emily said. "Yeah, but I thought it was, I don't know, I thought it was like a personality problem, a coldness thing." She uncrossed her arms. "Turns out you were just paying attention. The whole time, you were paying attention in a way that the rest of us weren't." She looked at Emily steadily. "I think I've been confusing quiet with absent my entire career. That's a thing I'm going to stop doing." Emily looked at her for a moment. "You were good that night," Emily said. "You moved the patients fast and you kept them calm and you held the corridor. You don't have to qualify your own work because of mine." Dara absorbed this. "Okay," she said. "Yeah? Okay." The corridor emptied. The supply carts went back to their positions. The monitors beeped. The building resumed being a building. Emily stood at the nursing station with the commendation folder on the counter beside her and pulled up the patient chart system, because bed 4 had a scheduled medication in 20 minutes, and she was not going to be late. She thought about Voss's face in the helicopter doorway, the specific quality of looking at someone and seeing them too late, after the calculations had already been made and the operations had already been run and the damage had already been done. The particular shock of discovering that what you'd dismissed as inconsequential had been, the entire time, the most consequential thing in the room. She thought about the 3 years between the report and the night, the quiet posting, the reduced access, the systematic effort to make her small and peripheral and manageable. She thought about how close it had come to working, how there had been weeks in the first year when she'd wondered whether the transfer was the right lesson to take from the experience, whether the right response to institutional resistance was to stop pushing against it and simply exist within it and find satisfaction in the smaller scale. She had not stopped. Not entirely. She'd kept doing the work, kept paying attention, kept being the person in the room who knew where everything was and what everything meant and how to move through a building when the lights went out. She hadn't done it strategically. She'd done it because it was who she was, and who she was had turned out to matter in a way she hadn't planned for and couldn't have designed. That was the thing she would have wanted to tell herself 3 years ago, if she could have. Not that it would work out, not that justice was coming, not that the institution would eventually correct itself. None of those things were promises she could have made because none of them were guaranteed. What she would have said was simpler than that. Keep doing the work. Not because someone is watching, not because it will be recognized, because the work is real and the people it protects are real, and the quality of your attention is the only thing that is entirely yours. Nobody can transfer that. Nobody can suppress it. Nobody can send 9 people into a building to retrieve it because it's not a document. It's not a record. It's just you, in the room, paying attention. She pulled up the chart for bed 4. Outside the north windows, the Arctic sky held its hard blue, and the road to Iron Creek was open, and the world was continuing in the way that worlds did, imperfectly, with ongoing complexity, without clean endings. And Emily Carter was at her nursing station, present, attentive, doing the job. Not the nurse people had looked past, not the asset someone had tried to contain, not the problem someone had attempted to eliminate before it became inconvenient. Just the person who had been there the whole time, paying attention, waiting for the moment when paying attention was the exact thing the situation required. That moment had come. She had not wasted it.